Hello. Today we start discussing different domains within personality psychology, and we will start with one of the most influential and most popular domains, which is also called dispositional domain. So, not surprisingly, the main concept within this domain is the concept of disposition, right? So, the disposition domain concerns those aspects of personalities that are stable over time and are relatively consistent over situations and make people different from each other. So, the term disposition itself often used because it refers to an inherent tendency to behave in a specific way and used often interchangeably with the concept of trait. So in the textbook, they basically used completely interchangeably, like disposition is the same as trait, trait is the same as disposition. So traits that underlie behavior can remain stable, yet the traits expressed in behavior can change over a person's lifespan. So here's the basic idea of this domain is that people differ from each other based on traits they have. Those traits are relatively stable over time. So if we will measure them, they probably will stay the same in the same person for quite some time before it will change. So zoo personality can change over time, but still most of the time it stays stable, except periods of change, right? So we can measure those traits and through them try to explain the behavior and create overall personality profile. So this is the main ideas here. So how can we approach that? Though it's connected, those ideas connected with some methodological and theoretical problems, which we need to discuss. So this approach has its advantages and disadvantages. First of all, dispositional domain psychologists should try to answer three fundamental questions. So first of all, how should we conceptualize traits, like what it is exactly? Second, how can we identify which traits more important and less important, right? Because people can possibly differ from each other based on thousands of different characteristics. We cannot measure and analyze all of them, and probably not all of them are equally important, right? So we maybe want to try to find the most important characteristics and deal with them. And finally, how can we create a classification or so-called taxonomy of traits, right? So if we figured out what traits are the most important, how we can classify them and create taxonomy, systems that includes all the major traits of personality. So before we will consider those taxonomies, we need to try to answer all these three questions to understand clearly how dispositional domains perceives personality. So first of all, conceptualization of traits. So the idea is that traits are somewhat dimensions, and each personality trait is distributed normally, right? So you know about the concept of normal distribution from the course of research methods and statistics and psychology. So you probably know that most of personality characteristics and other psychological variables really distributed normally, which means that most of people have an average level of certain trait, and we have quite a few people on extremes with very low and very high results. It might be applicable to intelligence, extroversion, achievement motivation, or many other factors. So there was a hypothesis that there are different types of personality and that those traits are create combinations, but this assumption didn't find any evidence, and probably most of traits are independent from each other and distributed normally. So some personality psychologists view these traits as internal properties of individuals that cause behavior. So why you behave like that? Because you are an extrovert. Why you behave like that? It's because you have high conscientiousness. But some psychologists suppose that no, we cannot make an assumptions on what is the cause and effect, and just basically use the concept of trait just to describe typical behavior. So it's not the reason behind this behavior, it's just a label for the typical behavior. So it's quite a debate, actually, so how we actually should treat and conceptualize the concept of traits. So psychologists who suppose that traits are internal dispositions also think that they might lie dormant. So you have a disposition, the trait, but it doesn't manifest itself yet. So traits can be considered as capacities that remain present, even if not actually expressed. So in this sense, traits, internal needs, drives, and desires presumed to exist even in the absence of observable behavior expressions, right? So if we didn't see the exact behavior, doesn't necessarily mean that the trait is absent, right? Other psychologists who think it's merely a description suppose that traits are just purely descriptive summaries. So if you say, oh, this person is an extrovert, it's just a description of their usual behavior, and they don't think that there are any dormant traits because we don't assume any causal relationships here. So proponents of this formulation make no assumptions about causality or eternality, just descriptive. So, and they suppose that first we need to identify and describe the important individual differences among people, and then maybe we will develop some theories about like causal relationships between them. So it's a debate, right? You can choose the side because they exist. Though the second point of view that we should perceive personality traits as a descriptive summaries more popular nowadays, so more researchers utilize this perspective on this problem. So come to the second question. What are the most important traits? It's a very, very good question, very good answer. Again, it's a subject of theoretical methodological debates within personality psychology field. So basically, idea is that yes, traits can be divided into groups, and some of them more important than others. The problem is what are the most important traits and what are the least important traits? How we can determine that? Historically, there were three fundamental approaches to answer this question. The first one was the lexical approach. So according to this approach, all traits listed and defined in the dictionary form can be used as possible personality characteristic. So we need to start with studying natural language, which has a lot of words describing personality. It should be starting point to answer the question about like what are the most important traits. The second approach is statistical. So this approach uses the statistical procedure factor analysis, which again you probably know from the course of research methods in psychology, to identify personality traits. So it's more statistical mathematical approach. And the final approach is theoretical. So we try to determine which traits are more important and less important based on the series of personality we take to consideration. And thus we create a theoretical classification. So let's discuss all these approaches in a bit more detail. So lexical approach starts with so-called lexical hypothesis. So lexical hypothesis, in simple words, is that all important individual differences have become encoded within the natural language. So idea is that if this trait is important, probably people would invent a word which specifically names that trait. And if there is no word to name certain differences, probably it wasn't that important in life of people, so they didn't invent a specific word for that. So the three terms that are not useful just do not have specific words in the language. It's a very simple idea. So in this approach, we can start with the dictionary, right? So we use two criteria here. First, synonym frequency. So if basically there are a lot of words which mean almost the same trait, it's super important trait. That is why people invented a lot of similar words to highlight different facets of the trait. And if this trait is really, really important, people in other languages also would have words for that trait. And if it's very specific trait, which has like naming only in 1-2 languages, it's maybe not that universal and not that important. So we would consider the most important traits, traits which have a lot of synonyms and which has the same like a meaning in different languages. So that is the idea for research. The problem with this approach to define what are the most important characteristics of personality and the least important characteristic of personality. This strategy facts that personality is conveyed through different parts of speech, including adjectives, nouns, and adverbs. So we cannot use only adjectives as initially was the idea, but if we take nouns and adverbs, it creates thousands and dozens of thousands words and possible combinations, right? Because sometimes we don't name some personality characteristics with only one word, like sociable or gregarious. Sometimes we use some colloquial expressions, for example, like your smart pants, right? And it's also characteristic of personality, but it's not only like adjective or noun, it's a whole expression. And if we start to consider those combinations, it becomes almost impossible to study it even within one language, not talking about like comparing it with all other languages in the world. So that's why the lexical approach probably a good starting point, and it was a starting point historically speaking in personality psychology for identifying important individual differences, but it shouldn't be utilized exclusively. That is why statistical approach comes into place, and it was like historically the second approach. So statistical approach identifies important traits, starting with a pool of personality A items, which actually could be picked up through lexical analysis. So it's historically how it happened. Personality psychologists found around 20,000 of words within English language to name different personality characteristics that were adjectives. After that, they tried to ask people to combine similar ones, right, which are almost kind of the same, like, for example, like pushy and persistent can be considered as somewhat similar, right, or like sociable and talkative. Right, so, and then they use this for further statistical analysis. So lexical approach creates this large pool of items, and then statistical approach is used to calculate. So basic idea is that factor analysis procedure helps to identify large groups or clusters of personality traits So if people think that several words have the similar meaning, we group them together, which helps us to diminish the amount of traits from like 20,000 to some manageable list of personality traits, which we can consider more important. So the procedural factor analysis is like literally aimed to do that with data. So in this sense, the goal of statistical approach is to identify the major dimensions or coordinates of the personality map, basically much the way we have a map of Earth. So statistical procedure of factor analysis reduces a large array of diversity of personality traits into smaller, more useful set of underlying factors here. So, for example, most of taxonomies we will discuss later in this domain has statistical approach as the initial point of how they were created. For example, Raymond Quetelet in the middle of 20th century, based on this procedure of factor analysis, created 16 factors of personality based on this procedure from 20,000 of adjectives mentioned in English language, as I mentioned a couple of minutes before. So it was a possible classification of personality. Now we don't use 16 personality factors according to Raymond Quetelet as obsolete, but we use other taxonomies which are based on the same idea and created more recently. So theoretical approach utilizes completely different logic. So the basic idea is that identifying important dimensions of individual differences starts with a series that determines which variables are more important. So theoretical approach starts with a theory, and because of that, it has also some advantages and disadvantages, strengths and limitations. The strong side is that if the theory you take as a foundation, strong, so your classification would be strong too. But again, so if the theory you take for the classification is weak, your classification also would be weak. So it fully depends on the theory which you use as a foundation, as a basis for this classification, right? So you can choose possibly different theories. For example, classical psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud. In this theory, depends on which stage of psychosexual development a person stuck in. They can develop different type of personality like oral, anal, phallic, and so on. And thus, foundation for determining the most important personality traits is this periodization of psychosexual developments theory created by Sigmund Freud. It's one simple example how it might work. So in more modern psychology, of course, it would be different theories, but the idea is the same. So speaking about like how widespread those approaches are, so statistical approach is more popular in modern psychology. So lexical approach was the starting point. Zoo, we will speak about like classification of personality traits made by on the basis of theoretical approach as well. So speaking about taxonomies, right? So when we determined the most important traits, we need to understand how to classify them, because probably there will be more than 2 traits, right, in a classification. So we need to understand, can we group them, how they're related with each other, and thus create a taxonomy, right? It's a more fancy word for classification in this sense. So basic definition is that taxonomy is scientific process of classifying things. And the most influential taxonomies in personality psychology we will discuss in the next video would be a hierarchical model of personality by Hans Ising, circumplex taxonomies of personality created by Timothy Leary and Jerry Wiggins, the most famous Big Five model. Its revision in contemporary psychology, which is called hexagon model, and very interesting smaller classification, which is called the dark triad. So we will discuss those taxonomies in the next video, but now you understand on which basis they are created and what are possible problems with the classification of personality traits in this domain. Thank you. See you next time.